One of the habits of the Prophet Muhammad PBUH was to ask people after prayer about what they dreamt about, and he would interpret the meaning of the dream. One day, the Prophet told one of his companions about his own dream. The Prophet was sleeping in his dream and two people woke him up and said, "Proceed, proceed." Prophet Muhammad PBUH said, "I went with these two people, and asked who are they? We went, and we saw a man lying on the ground and there was a man holding a rock behind the man's head. The man who's holding the rock looks at the man who's lying down, and he throws the rock and crushes the man's head. The Prophet said that it rolled and rolled and the man who threw the rock went after the rock, but by the time he picks the rock up, he returns to man lying on the ground and his head returns to normal, as if his head wasn't crushed. The man then crushes the head again and the Prophet says, 'What are you two doing?' The men said, 'Proceed, proceed.' The Prophet described a very similar position. He saw a man lying on the ground and there was a man who was standing on his head. But this time the man standing had a hook which was made of iron. The man standing goes to the man's head and pokes his eye, and he goes all the way back, which was the back of the head, and tears his face apart. Then the man goes to the same side and rips the nose all the way down to the back. Then he goes to the mouth and tears it all the way to the back. By the time the man goes to the other side of the face, the first side goes back to normal. Bearing in mind that the man who was lying on the ground was going through continuous pain, the Prophet was terrified when he saw this. The Prophet says to the people who are next to him and says, 'Who are these people? What are they doing?' They say, 'Proceed, proceed.' The Prophet PBUH then saw an oven, and when they looked inside, they saw men and women in the oven, naked. The fire then turns on and the people in the oven try to get out of it, but they can't because the oven is closed. The Prophet says to the people who are next to him and says, 'Who are these people? What are they doing?' They say, 'Proceed, proceed.' Then the Prophet PBUH saw a man swimming in a river which looked red like blood. As the man is swimming towards the shore, there's a man next to the shore, holding rocks. When the man swimming comes to the side of the river, he opens his mouth and the man with the rocks throws the rock inside the man's mouth and the man continues to swim again. Then the man swimming comes to the side of the river again. He opens his mouth and the man with the rocks throws the rock inside the man's mouth and the man continues to swim again. Then the Prophet said to the two people, 'What's going on?' They say, 'Proceed, proceed.' Then the Prophet sees a man with a repulsive face. The Prophet says that he's never seen a face like this before. The Prophet saw the man turn a fire on and walk around the fire, and the Prophet said to the two people, 'What's going on?' They say, 'Proceed, proceed.' This was one of the scariest parts of the dream the Prophet saw. Then the Prophet sees a beautiful garden with lots of vegetation. The Prophet saw a man who was so tall that the Prophet couldn't see the head properly. There were lots of children surrounding the tall man. The Prophet had never seen so many children in his life. And the Prophet asked, 'What's going on?' But nobody answered. The Prophet proceeded for the final time into a garden and that he'd never seen before. It was a special garden with a gate, and they opened the gate and the two men said, 'Go up and rise.' So they rose all the way up, until they found a city made of gold and silver. They saw men who they'd never seen before. They looked like two opposite images in the same body. One half was beautiful. The Prophet had never seen men more handsome than them. However, the other half was very hideous. Then one of the people with the Prophet said to the men to jump into a white river. The men jumped into the river. Prophet Muhammad PBUH said, "When the men left the river, they became beautiful." Then one of the people with the Prophet said, "Look!" The Prophet looked and saw a beautiful palace, which was in the shape of a cloud, and they said to the Prophet, "This is your palace." And the Prophet says, "May Allah bless you, now get me inside." They said, "Not now, when the time is right, you will enter the palace." Then the Prophet said, You made me see so many strange things today, please explain them to me. They said, Now we will explain everything to you. The two people who were with the prophet were angels. The man lying on the ground used to read the Quran but abandoned it. He would miss prayer intentionally. The man whose eyes, nose, and mouth was ripped by a hook, he lied every day. The people burning in the oven committed adultery. The man who was swimming in the river that was blood red dealt with interest and consumed money earned from interest. The man who had a repulsive face and was walking around the fire was Malik, the gatekeeper of hell. The tall man who was surrounded by lots of children were the children who died at a very young age. And the one who lost their children at a very young age are with Prophet Ibrahim PBUH. The men who were half beautiful, half hideous, they would do good and bad deeds. Then they would go into the river to purify themselves from bad sins. May Allah forgive us and protect from these major sins and punishments.